A pleasant day, ma'am. My name is Dimer Sigba from BS Ed English 2A. So in this video, I am going to discuss Literature 1, Week 3 module. So the first topic is discuss the development of children's literature during the 18th century and mention the important events that happened in the following dates. So, the 18th century was the starting point of children's literature as we know it. This was when books specifically were created and designed just for children. They focused primarily on moral lessons and how one should act and objected to tales of magic, wizards, and talking animals because of religious constraints. So first, we have the 1720. This year's Divine and Moral Songs for Children's by Isaac Watts created one of the first poetry books meant for children only. One of his songs being Joy to the World. This song is still present in school choir performances. Next is the 1744. The trend of illustrating children's books prevailed and children's literature grew in popularity throughout the 18th and 19th century. A Pretty Little Pocket Book by John Newbery. John Newbery realized that most children's books were only school books. He jumped into an untapped market and came out with his own collection of stories, illustrations, and poems, and it instantly became a must-have for children. Next is the 1762. 1762, Emily by Jean Kess, another finder of education that we currently stay. His book Smile was an explanation of the idealization that children should reckon. A recent advocate for sampling and living a moral life. Next topic is discuss the development of children's literature at the end of the 18th century. So by the end of the 18th century, children's literature was a flourishing, separate, and secure part of the publishing industry in Britain. Perhaps as many as 50 children's books were being printed each year, mostly in London. However, also in regional centers such as Edinburgh, York, and Newcastle. By today's standards, these books can seem pretty dry and they were often very moralizing. However, the books were clearly meant to please the readers, whether with entertaining stories and appealing characters, the pleasant tone of the writing, or attractive illustrations and eye-catching page layout and bindings. Most of children's literature in the 18th century was dominated by female authors. Their focus was on moral lessons that were supposed to instruct children on ways of proper living. Most of these stories were dry, boring, or condescending to kids. Moral tales for children written by Maria Edgeworth, Sarah Trimmer, and so on. Next topic is discuss the development of children's literature by mentioning the important events that happened during the beginning 1812, 1827, and 1835, the middle 1865, and the end 1877, 1878, and 1888 of the 19th century. So the 19th century brought back the long-told folk tales and fairy tales that were loved by children, however shied away from in the 18th century. Children's literature began to focus on writing for entertainment for purposes rather than just moral lessons. So first we have the beginning, during the 1812. Kinder und Hausmärchen, originally known as Children's and Household Tales by Wilhelm and Jacob Grimm, the most well-known and most widely distributed book worldwide of German cultural history. They are at the same time the first systematic compilation and the first scientific documentation of the inter-European and Oriental fairy tale tradition. Next is 1827, The Youth Companions. First publication, a magazine geared for children. So the latter, published in Boston, was typically wholesome in content, intended to warn against the ways of transgression and to encourage virtue and piety. Then during the 1835, fairy tales by Hans Christian Andersen. Andersen's fairy tales, consisting of 156 stories across 9 volumes, have been translated into more than 125 languages. They have become culturally embedded in the West collective consciousness. Readily accessible to children, however, presenting lessons of virtue and resilience in the face of adversity for mature readers. His most famous fairy tales include The Emperor's New Clothes, The Nightingale, The Steadfast, Tin Soldier, The Red Shoes, and so on. These stories have inspired ballets, plays, and animated and live-action film. The 19th century middle, during the 1865 of the 19th century, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll. This book is often seen as the first book written purely for entertainment purposes. The captivating characters and wild fantasies are still being recreated and told today in recent movies, geared for both children's and adult audiences. In the 19th century, and with the inventions and improvement made to color printing, children's books started to have more vivid illustrations. The end of the 19th century is when children's literature really came into its own and continued to develop in the 20th century. During the 1877, the Baby's Opera by Walter Crane, also known as Children's Illustrations, contains the music for many English nursery songs and is one of Crane's best-known toy books. And 1878, John Gilpin's Ride by Randolph Caldecott, the diverting history of John Gilpin showing how he went further than he intended, and came safe home again, is a comic ballad by William Cowper, written in 1782. The ballad concerns a dapper called John Gilpin who rides around with a horse. The poem was republished in 1878, illustrated by Randolph Caldecott, and printed by Edmond Evans. Caldecott's image of Gilpin riding the horse is the basis for the design of the obverse of the Caldecott medal. So in 1888, The Pied Piper of Hamelin by Kate Greenaway. The Pied Piper of Hamelin is a very interesting story of young zestful man, and his Pied Piper. The Pied Piper of Hamelin is a moral story in which a young man's retaliation actually proves to be moral lessons for an entire town. The young man was actually amazingly talented, honest, and wise. In the story, he uses his talent to save an entire city. So that's all, and thank you for listening.